Katie, thanks for joining me. So, firstly, first women's reporter for The Telegraph. Can you tell us a bit about that and sort of your route into journalism?
Yeah, so I started when I was 15 just doing blogs about Bradford in my bedroom at home because they were my local team, the team that I supported, and then got to know everybody at the club quite well and built up a bit of a reputation for doing Bradford things. And then during that time I started working at the BBC. I did a scheme called the Kick-Off Scheme, which was like an entry-level scheme, work experience for 8 weeks at local radio. Then from then moved into BBC Sport, and then when I graduated in July, I was really lucky that this job came up. So I was at BBC Sport for not full time or a contract or anything, but just in there 3 or 4 days a week. And then this job came up, interview, got it, and then here we are at Chelsea. So that's kind of, that's the route in, I think.
And what's it been like for you so far, being able to cover so much women's football?
It's been really exciting because, it's a really good paper to work for, because obviously you see the announcement yesterday, or rather Monday, with the new dedicated women's sports section, and then more integrated coverage, more coverage than ever before, dedicated editors, big columnists like Maggie Alfonsi, Jordan Nobbs, Judy Murray, a really good dedicated women's sport editor in Anna Kessel, so the first women's sport editor on a national paper devoted solely to women's sport. And you look at the investment and interest, and it's not just a token thing, it's not just an empty gesture, it's when you work on the desk every day, they're constantly pushing you to think about women's sport in new ways and trust in your expertise and to produce more content. They take it seriously, they give space to it, so it's just a really nice place to work where you don't have to justify why you're covering women's sport, you don't have to justify the importance of women's sport. It's that they value it, they want to give space to it, they want to treat it just as they treat the men's sport, and that's really, really refreshing for us, that it's not, I know journalists at some papers where they have to constantly fight to justify why they're interested in the game or why this is important. It's a desk often come to me with things as much as I go to them, so it's just really nice to work in an environment where it's really valued and really held up as something that's important that they want to work on, so that's really refreshing.
And having that women's section, what do you think that's going to do? What's the main aim for everyone involved in that project?
I think it sort of mirrors a little bit the Barclays announcement, because Emma Hayes kind of tied the two together, as you're saying, that you see now with the Barclays sponsorship and with the Telegraph thing, that big companies are starting to see that women's sport is profitable, so it's not just a token thing or we'll put some money at it to look good, it's that they're starting to see there's a really commercial return on doing it, and they're starting to see the importance of, for years in the media we've just neglected women's sport. You'll know this, how often you open a paper and there's been no women's sport. The FA Cup final a few years ago, very few papers did anything on it. I think it's something like 2% of newspaper coverage is on women's sport for 50% of the population, so you're looking at a massive percentage of the population that's just never been represented in sport, and something that has been undervalued despite the England national team obviously being primed for success this year, despite the Women's Super League becoming a very good product, despite the England netball and hockey doing really well. We've just systematically as a press devalued it and not looked at it in the right way for years and years and years, whereas now all of a sudden the last week, not just Barclays, but Gatorade, Lucasade, Budweiser, all these big brands are suddenly getting on board and really seeing the value of women's sport and the way that we can invest in it and really turn it into something. So I think that's the thing. I think that we're all feeding into a nice virtuous circle of improving coverage, changing perceptions, better sponsorship deals, better exposure. It's just a nice circle where we're all kind of aiming for the same thing for women's sport.
And touching on the Barclays sponsorship, it's huge. What impact can this have on women's football?
It's unbelievable. It's just because just even talking about with you just can't think where to start, because it's just going to be so wide range. And there's a precedent stuff that I was talking about before, that, and Emma Hayes mentioned this, that are we at a point now where loads of other brands are going to think, Barclays can do it, who've obviously had the association with the Men's Premier League for so long, then why can't we do it? Why aren't we doing it? Which I think is the best thing, because so long in women's sport it's been like, should we cover it or should we send someone there? And now it's like, well, why not? Which I think that changing attitude is huge. I think from a funding perspective, prize money for the first time, Emma, we heard at her press conference, was saying that the FA Cup games, the prize pot is so small that by the time they've travelled, got hotels, paid everybody, they've actually made a loss. So it's now the first time that, as well as having these grants, you're in a position where women's clubs are going to make a profit perhaps, or are going to be in a position where they can be more self-sustaining, because as we know, the Chelseas, the Man Cities, the Arsenals are very heavily reliant on the investment from the men's clubs. So it's just going to completely, I think, overhaul how women's football works in England, but also how it's perceived internationally, because last few years, speaking to a lot of people who work in Germany, who work in France, are sort of very dazzled by the growing threat of not just English teams in the Champions League, but the English league being as strong and as competitive as it is, and it's the only fully professional league in Europe. So it's a huge thing. It's like Emma was saying in a press conference now that America's actually lagging behind, when for so long America's was where everybody flocked. So it's just a huge thing that changes perceptions, that changes money and sponsorship finances, that changes how women's football is perceived in the UK and abroad. It's just a massive, massive thing in a really big week for women's sport, I think.
And even today, being at Emma Hayes' press conference, there's a full room of journalists really taking an interest now. Where would you sort of rank Chelsea in terms of, can they compete in the Champions League at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because, as Emma was saying, that your PSGs, your Wolfsburgs, your Lyons are operating on twice the budget that they are because they're just bankrolled by these men's clubs. And even PSG, that they want to be the best league in the world, but you speak to people there and they know that Lyon is so far ahead and setting the pace. So it's difficult to gauge how competitive they actually are, like in the grand scheme of things, and where the league's going to go and everything. But I think it's a huge development from where they were. Years ago we had no English teams in the Champions League, or not as regularly. We have the odd ones like Birmingham's, your Bristols, etc., and they would get rolled over, whereas now we've had years where consistently getting to this point is really, really exciting. When the exciting thing as well, of course, is just one game, so it's always rather two legs, so it's two games, but it's obviously it's the one night rather than the consistent excellent thing, and you know that anything can happen. And we've seen with Emma Hayes' Chelsea that they've struggled to score at the start of the season, but now they've produced in the big moments. So yeah, hopefully we'll see. But hopefully, fingers crossed.
So next year is going to be a big year for women's football, just after the Women's World Cup in France, the new sponsorship deal. Do you think, I mean, Emma Hayes sort of spoke about she's excited 10 years' time in the women's game. Do you think that's how long it might take, or do you think it's going to maybe happen even quicker than that?
I think we have sort of turned a significant corner now, because I've spoken to people who've covered women's football a lot longer than me, because they're a lot older than me, and they were sort of saying that every year everyone says, oh, this is the year it's going to take off, and then it's like, oh, and it's a bit anticlimactic. And I think in 2015 England had the success that they had in Canada, and then I don't think the FA were necessarily ready for how to capitalise on that. They sort of did this fairly feeble campaign of come and watch the Lionesses play at XYZ clubs, and it wasn't really sort of capitalised on in the right way. And I think you saw that with very quickly it reverted to a winter league, and the attendances, you had the spike after the World Cup, then it kind of petered out fairly limply, and then I think this is the one where I think, because it's been so long in the making, everyone's been talking about France. England have been very bold about we're going to win it, they've won it, she believes. Whether you think that's in a statement of intent or not is up to what you make of how well the other teams played, but you can't deny people were watching it and talking to me about it who don't normally watch women's football. So it feels like, because it's been so long in the making, it feels like a moment where the FA will have thought, right, this XYZ, this is what we're going to do to capitalise on that. You've got this new sponsorship deal, it just feels very different all of a sudden. And that you have, obviously, we know when we do England games, you get bigger crowds, and WSL games, stuff like this. We've had a bigger press conference hall than you do for a normal Chelsea game when there isn't a press conference. So it does start to feel a little bit different this year. So hopefully next year is really going to be a year when we start to see the attendances rise week on week.
And how do you rate England's chances maybe for the World Cup in France? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, initially before She Believes, I was sort of a little bit worried. I thought, we watched the Sweden game when they were a little bit tepid. We watched Brazil when they definitely should have scored more than they did score, but they played very well. And the game with Australia when they should have done better than a draw. So there were a lot of concerns, I think, with their finishing, with various the things that he didn't seem to have decided on a set 11, and I think there were a lot of worries about, are they as good as they think they are, because they were all talking about we're going to win it. And I think after She Believes, regardless of how well you think the other teams played, and obviously Japan didn't feel a full strength team for that last game, you've sort of seen an England squad with a lot of depth, with a lot of tenacity, a lot of intelligence in the way that they play, because they've had a lot of half-time substitutions that have just completely changed the game. So you can see Phil Neville thinking about it in a particular way, and I think the signs bode really, really well. So I think that's reassuring. So whether they're going to win the gold medal, you're looking at Australia being in a little bit of disarray because of their managerial change, America having their pay dispute and not necessarily being in a very good moment. I don't think they were as good as She Believes as everyone expected them to be. Are you thinking other nations that have been the leading lights are maybe not as strong this time around as well, whereas England are? So I think that's really going to play into their favour a little bit. So why not, hopefully.
And if England do win the World Cup, what impact do you think that will have on women's football in this country?
I think it'll be. It's easy to say it will be huge, but then you look at the gold medal in, hockey, and the gold medal, Commonwealth gold medal in netball, and the Commonwealth gold medal in netball. They've done that in exactly the right way. That straight away they were like, yeah, we're overhauling the league, we're getting a TV deal, and then you see the attendance is there, the interest in there, the way that netball. You had Paul Scholes the other day saying, oh, I really like netball, and everyone thinks it's really pathetic, but it's really high tempo, and the way that they've done it is kind of the model. I think that they had an actual plan in place of how they're going to capitalise on that, whereas the hockey success has been less sustained and less. I think you saw with Samantha Quick on I'm a Celebrity, and that was kind of it. So it's whether there's going to be the infrastructure and the plan in place of how do we take that success and then sustain it into everything else, because that's going to be the big thing, that women's sport for so long has been defined by loads of gold medals at the Olympics, great, England's bronze medal, hockey gold medal, Commonwealth gold medal or whatever, and then it's just kind of gone quiet again and just reverted to type. Whereas now you're hoping with a sponsorship deal like this is going to be the year where that sustains after and that interest is prolonged, because we've got more media coverage than ever before, the access is still really, really good, hopefully new TV deals and the offing, that's been the discussion today. Very tentative discussions at the moment because the current deals run till something like 2021, but you sort of everyone's thinking about it in a little bit of a different way, and I think that's going to be the key to really changing it long term.
And a key issue seems to be getting crowds at games. What do you think can be done to change this?
Yeah, it's a difficult issue because there's a lot of things. I mean, you say Chelsea Football Club and people, there's still a perception that, or an assumption rather, that clubs all play in the men's ground. So people say to me, oh yeah, Stamford Bridge is great, and it's like, well, that's not where they play in Wimbledon's ground, and same with Arsenal, play at Boreham Wood, which is far away from the Emirates, and you're looking obviously to get to Stamford Bridge. It's a very easy direct tube line, you're just there, it's right outside. The same with Wembley, the same with a lot of men's grounds in London, whereas a women's ground often you have to get over grounds and then it's quite a trek, so they're in very difficult places to get to, and the worst offenders are not the London clubs, but Reading play in Wickham, Brighton play in Crawley, then Yeovil play in miles away from Hewish Park. They play very far removed from where the men's clubs are based, so it's not naturally instinctive of, oh yeah, I'll just hop over and see what that's about, like it is at Man City where they're all based in the same section. So that's a big barrier, because then you're looking at the socio-economic barriers that are preventing kids from going, because if you're a Reading fan, it's quite a commitment to then do a kind of 30-mile journey, 30 miles back. It's a huge thing to ask a parent to do for a team that they've never seen before. So I think that's a big thing, and you saw that with the crowds when they played at the Majinski, that they peaked, there was their biggest crowds of the season and things. So I think that's a big thing of how can we make the games more accessible, can we play them in stadiums that have got better transport links that people are more accustomed to getting to, and can we publicise it more, because a lot of the games people don't know that they're going on. You're looking at even like the end of the season, last game of the season is men's Premier League. You potentially got a title decider in the WSL with West Ham with Man City, Arsenal. That could go right down to the wire on the same weekend as last weekend of the men's Premier League. So it's little things like that scheduling. I don't think that was thought through very well. So it's those little barriers that might not seem big things, but how can we overcome those is a massive thing, as well as just raising the profile and the interest, because I think Chelsea, I was saying this to someone, that you look at Chelsea women have a massive social media following, and people feel very connected to Frank Kirby, to Karen Carney, but there's something that's stopping them from actually getting to the games. I don't think it's just a commitment thing. I think it's not being used to necessarily going to this ground in the same way that we are all very used to going to Stamford Bridge or the Emirates or wherever else. And
you mentioned it could go down to the wire between Arsenal and Manchester City. It just shows how competitive this league is here in England. Where would you sort of rank, the English tier of women's football in comparison to other countries? Yeah, I think league-wise it's really, really strong, because you have got your big three in Arsenal, Manchester City, Chelsea, but you've got Birmingham that have kind of turning that into a top four and breaking through. But then you've got clubs like Bristol City where they don't have the same funding, but they're doing really, really good things. So they've held Manchester City to 2 draws this season that, looking back, might be the draws that decide everything else. And they've got a run where they play Chelsea before the end of the season, they play Arsenal before the end of the season. Could really be the kingmakers in the title race. So you've got that competition where it's not just a case of teams getting battered every week. Reading and Man City, you were there, it was a really, really closely fought game. And Everton, for all they lost 3-0 against Manchester City, really gave them a fright first half. So you are seeing it's not these massive margins anymore. You don't have the full-time, part-time divide anymore. You're not having that as an excuse, lack of fitness as an excuse for why people are being turned over. And the Championship as well, it was really, really tight. We expected Manchester United to walk it, but Spurs and Charlton have really kind of pushed them close. So the whole thing is just a lot more competitive than it is abroad. But at the same time, you're looking at, for example, in
in France when PSG and Lyon walk the league every year. I don't think we're quite there. We're not on a par with Wolfsburg yet. Chelsea's and Manchester City's are not as good as them. We'll find out on Tuesday if they're as good as PSG. So I think probably the best teams in other countries are potentially better than ours. But I think as a whole league, especially with this sponsorship now, no other league in the world can rival that. We're in a lot healthier position than a lot of other countries.
Well, thanks for joining us on this exciting day of women's football. A lot more to come, and we're feeling very positive about it. So stay tuned for more.